My landlord bought the diner I worked at just to force me to sit down. I was working a miserable morning shift when a man in a tailored suit walked in. He handed my manager a thick envelope of cash to close the restaurant early and send everyone home. Then, he slid an encrypted burner phone across my table. I realized right then that I wasn't just a tenant renting his dead mother's apartment. I was the Mafia boss's newest, untouchable obsession.
Let us examine the subject, Elena, against the freezing backdrop of Boston. She stands before an imposing red brick brownstone in Beacon Hill. In her hand is a shattered phone. Her final tether to society before eviction strips away her shelter. You and I have studied this exact behavioral cascade in countless case files. Physical exhaustion fractures the psyche, twisting a late-night rental listing into a perceived lifeline rather than a trap. When the owner responded instantly, her survival instincts suppressed all critical thinking. It is a fundamental truth of human psychology. Profound desperation acts as a sensory deprivation tank, blinding us to blatant danger when we are backed into the absolute darkest corners of our own survival. The digital directive on her fractured screen was highly specific. Arrive tomorrow at exactly 3 p.m. and come strictly alone. In any baseline psychological state, this isolation is a massive behavioral red flag. But when a subject is ground down by endless diner shifts, the primal cortex simply overwrites logical deduction. It is a quiet, devastating tragedy of the human condition. The crushing fear of tomorrow forces our minds to completely ignore the blaring alarms right in front of us. She drags her exhausted body up those immaculate stone steps, unnerved by the sterile perfection of the property. She anticipates a typical greedy landlord seeking a minor payout. Instead, the heavy oak door sweeps open to reveal the true, calculating architect of her impending psychological trauma. The imposing figure in the doorway is a textbook megalomaniac narcissist. Barely 30, he wears dark wool woven from wealth that completely eclipses her yearly wage. His polished shoes reflect the beweeping sky, but his sharp jawline and pitch-black eyes command absolute submission. He possesses that lethal, effortless magnetism specifically calibrated to lure intelligent minds into devastating psychological traps. We must log a crucial observation here. An immaculate, highly attractive surface is always the most effective camouflage for the brutal violence lurking underneath. He clinically dissects her worth in a single glance, then states that she is late. His voice is a low, measured threat, heavy with an unyielding accent that promises immediate consequences for failure. Elena frantically checks her broken screen, noting the time is 3:02 p.m. She stammers a defense, arguing that a 2-minute variable is statistically irrelevant. His glacial response establishes his total psychological dominance. In his pathological reality, a minor delay is a lethal offense. This is where her ordinary struggle collides with a maximum security mindset. Every biological impulse in her nervous system screams to retreat into the freezing rain. Yet, the grand foyer radiates an intensely seductive warmth. It is a profound human flaw and a clinical reality we often learn too late. Our deep craving for comfort easily silences the primitive warnings of our own intuition. She steps inside, sealing herself within a trap that smells of cedar and cold metal. He orders her to the 3rd floor, gliding past her toward the grand staircase without checking to see if she follows. Apex predators, with his violent pathology, do not request compliance. They demand it as a baseline reality. When chronic poverty hollows out your frontal lobe, you surrender your autonomy without a fight. The contrast is clinical. Her wet boots slap the cold marble, while his movements produce absolute silence. The architecture itself reflects his paranoia, with cameras monitoring every shadowed angle. As they pass an armed sentry, the psychological cage materializes. Life teaches us a hard truth about manipulation. We rarely hand over our power all at once. It bleeds away step by step until a struggling victim becomes a willing captive in a megalomaniac's den. Every neurological alarm bell in Elena's head signals that this environment is highly engineered to trap her. The boss easily reads the physical rigidity of her terror. In a terrifyingly flat tone, he states the suite belonged to his late mother, requiring only a quiet occupant. He displays zero physiological signs of grief. Yet we must always remember a painful truth about human behavior. The most agonizing psychological fractures are often buried beneath the coldest stoicism a mind can manufacture. Reaching the upper landing, he turns a brass key in ghostly silence. To enter, Elena must press uncomfortably close to his imposing physical frame, momentarily paralyzed by the massive capacity for violence radiating from the terrifying lack of distance between them. Stick with me here, because you and I need to carefully examine the clinical framing of this exact moment. The Havy with winter frost and premium whiskey. Elena stands frozen. Elena stands frozen, crushed by the narcissist's gravitational pull. The space is a flawless psychological lure, featuring gleaming hardwood and shelves packed with rare Italian literature. Her vocal cords tighten as she questions the bizarre economic disparity. How does a luxury penthouse rent for a mere $800? Leaning against the frame, he coldly states he knows the property's exact value. This exposes a timeless, brutal reality of our existence. The most destructive traps in life never look like iron cages. They always arrive perfectly disguised as impossible, miraculous strokes of luck. His low vocal resonance shatters the quiet, demanding to know if the habitat meets her requirements. Elena scans the crisp linens and thick glass, holding back the freezing storm. It is a space entirely devoid of decay. This represents the exact sanctuary her exhausted brain manifests during those traumatic diner shifts. Her mental defenses instantly collapse. She whispers her submission, labeling the room perfect. He aggressively closes the deal. When she asks about background checks, he wholly dismisses standard civilian protocol. He dictates his own moral axis. We must actively internalize this haunting behavioral lesson. Severe resource scarcity will consistently blind a starving human subject to the deadly, invisible strings attached to any sudden rescue. Pushing off the doorframe, he closes the distance with the silent pacing of an apex predator. He establishes his absolute behavioral mandates: pay their rent, respect the perimeter, and never investigate the shadows. He halts just 3 feet away, close enough to expose the violent scar bisecting his brow. With a chilling, practiced smoothness, he asks if she can manage that, addressing her directly as Elena. A severe autonomic response floods her veins with adrenaline. She stammers that she never provided her name. He produces a hollow, artificial smile, claiming it was on her application. She knows she left it blank. This forces us to confront a chilling fact of life. True terror is not the unknown. It is realizing the predator mapped your entire existence long before you ever met. Elena desperately demands his identity, a futile attempt to claw back a singular ounce of agency. His reaction is a masterclass in narcissistic dominance. He clinically labels himself a simple landlord who refuses to repeat his directives. When his hand slips inside his coat, Elena's amygdala hijacks her reasoning, flashing images of victims vanishing into the criminal underworld. But the weapon he extracts is merely a printed lease. He engineers a brutal psychological ultimatum: sign the paper or return to freezing destitution. He initiates a 30-second countdown in a terrifyingly flat tone. This sequence provides a profound lesson about our human limitations. Rational logic often screams for us to flee, but the intoxicating promise of survival will forever anchor our trembling feet. Superficially, the contract mimics a standard civilian agreement, but buried in the text is a pathological mandate demanding total silence regarding his operations. When she questions this clause, he applies extreme psychological pressure, dropping the countdown to 20 seconds. She protests, and he ruthlessly slashes the timeline to 15. 10, 9, 8. The mental suffocation in that room is absolute. Let us pause and look at this together, because here lies a bitter reality we must all inevitably face. Elena envisions the massive debt and freezing streets waiting outside. The most defining choices in our lives are almost never a noble battle between right and wrong. We are typically just forced to willingly accept the lesser of two totally devastating psychological nightmares. The physical environment wraps around her, generating a powerful illusion of safety as the final seconds bleed away. 5-4. Driven by pure biological imperative, Elena grabs the pen and permanently alters her reality with a panic signature. The narcissist reclaims the contract, verifying her compliance before offering a chilling, minimal nod. Welcome home, Elena. He promises his syndicate will transport her meager belongings tonight. Pivoting toward the exit, he deliberately lets a heavy, calculated silence dominate the room before issuing his final mandate. If you see something, it vanishes. If you hear something, it never existed. We must clinically recognize the tragic life lesson here. Finding absolute sanctuary in a broken world always demands a devastating psychological toll. Let us examine Elena, frozen by the living room window. Observe the physical markers of acute stress as the heavy oak door clicks shut. The predator, Alessandro, demonstrates classic megalomaniacal narcissism. He does not raise his voice. He simply leans into her personal space, dropping his tone to a lethal whisper to establish absolute dominance. He conditions her with a chilling phrase, calling her a good girl. It is a calculated verbal strike meant to infantilize and strip away her agency. He promises the keys and leaves, his boots echoing down the marble stairs. You and I must understand the psychology of this trap. The most effective prisons never use iron bars. They are aligned on the quiet, built entirely on the quiet. Desperate compromises we make when survival overrides our basic human instinct to flee. Watch Elena stare down at the street. The strangers under their umbrellas are entirely oblivious to the psychological submission occurring above them. Notice how her nervous system finally crashes. She drops onto a luxurious mattress that contrasts sharply with her previous life. The isolation phase has officially begun. In the glow of the bedside lamp, she spots a silver frame holding a photograph of a tired woman and a joyful young boy. A wave of cognitive dissonance washes over our subject. We often learn this harsh reality the hard way. The trauma we try to outrun frequently waits for us in the most beautiful environments. The deepest psychological scars do not come from monsters in the dark, but from the polished rooms we mistakenly call a safe haven. Look closely at her trembling hands. The boy in that photograph shares the exact same sociopathic eyes as the syndicate boss who just claimed ownership of her life. Behind the picture lies the real psychological trigger. She slides out a card reading his name and private acquisitions. No contact information is provided, a classic isolation tactic. Flipped over, black ink reveals his core pathology. Always collect what is owed. Her breathing becomes frantic, a textbook panic response. She shoves the card away. Here is the clinical truth about human predators. They rarely hide in the shadows. They mask their sadism behind quiet favors, systematically convincing fabulously victims, nubbled only farmers away the brutal to survive. The brutal storm outside. Her fight-or-flight response is firing at maximum capacity, urging her to run. But the psychological conditioning is taking root. She has willingly locked herself inside a highly controlled environment. Right on schedule, an envelope slides under the door containing 3 brass keys. This initiates a disturbing behavioral loop. At midnight, she unpacks. At 2 in the morning, she obsessively scrubs a clean marble counter until her skin is raw, trying to regain some microscopic sense of control. By 4, she sits completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the deadbolt. We see this exact pattern constantly in clinical case studies. Desperation is a dangerous cognitive distortion. It quietly overrides our rational mind, pulling us into suffocating situations we would otherwise instinctively reject. Morning light exposes the severe toll of her hypervigilance. She has not slept at all. Tremors rack her hands as she steps into the tub, letting the water run punishingly hot. She aggressively scrubs her skin, a textbook somatic response. She is trying to physically wash away through the cyclogyl contamination of his gaze. Alessandro's whisper loops endlessly in her memory, laying the early groundwork for a traumatic captive bond. Soon she puts on a faded diner uniform. Using it as emotional armor, it highlights a profound coping mechanism of the human brain. We often take our most paralyzing fears and bury them deeply under mundane routines. We rely entirely on the repetitive mechanics of everyday survival to keep our fragile psyche from completely fracturing into pieces. Let us examine the subject, Elena, staring into a fogged mirror. Her walk through the cold streets is a neurological survival march. With every step, she systematically suppresses her primal threat detection instincts. She desperately convinces herself that megalomaniacal predators, like Alessandro, simply forget the properties they buy. She projects the image of a grieving son onto a kingpin, all to justify a cheap lease. Entering the diner, the scent of stale coffee acts as her psychological security blanket. This presents a chilling behavioral pattern. We must recognize this human flaw. We will often fracture our own reality and ignore glaring red flags, just to manufacture a fleeting sense of safety when the wolf is already inside our house. Let us assess her environmental stressors. You and I understand the psychological toll of acute grief. Combine that bereavement with crippling debt and her cognitive load becomes suffocating. Predatory collectors hunted Elena down right after her mother's death. Inside the diner, we observe Rita, a veteran waitress acting as a surrogate maternal figure. She immediately notes Elena's extreme fatigue. Elena displays classic dissociation, moving like an automaton. Rita is the only one aware of Elena's near homelessness and delivers a grounding touch to her shoulder. This serves as a vital psychological reminder. We often construct massive mental walls to survive trauma, but a single, unexpected moment of genuine human empathy can bring that entire defensive fortress crashing down. Rita gestures to the corner booth. Elena forces a superficial smile. But approaching the stranger triggers a severe stress response. Sitting with predatory stillness is a man radiating the controlled energy of a clinical psychopath. His dead eyes track her with chilling precision. She attempts to regulate her vocal tremors. Instead, the subject, Luca, weaponizes her identity by softly speaking her full name. He clinically recites her age, her mother's time of death, and her deepest traumas with absolute emotional detachment. We are witnessing her nervous system flood with sheer terror. This highlights a profound psychological reality. We can desperately repress our painful history in the dark, but the past is a relentless, starving hunter, and it will always find a way to track us down. Luca's tone remains perfectly modulated as he catalogs her social isolation, deliberately inducing learned helplessness. When he whispers her new address, Her motor control fails. The pot slams down, spilling coffee. Her fight-or-flight response peaks as she demands his name. He introduces himself as Luca Alessandro's enforcer. She stammers, using her shift as a desperate excuse to escape. Luca responds with an empty simulation of a smile. Observe this shift in the clinical power dynamic. He calmly states he purchased the diner 30 minutes prior. Her boss has already been paid off. This exposes a dark behavioral truth. True psychological dominance never raises its voice. It simply uses overwhelming resources to permanently buy the battlefield. In acute panic, Elena scans the room. Her anchor, Rita, has vanished. She spots her manager clutching an envelope of cash. This rapid removal of her support structure triggers a physiological collapse. She drops into the booth. Luca's eyes register clinical satisfaction. He praises her surrender as if conditioning a captive animal. He states that Alessandro sent him to redefine the boundaries of her reality. She hides her tremors as Luca casually reclassifies her status. She is now a guarded asset of the syndicate. He slides a secure phone across the table, forming a coercive tether. This teaches us a vital lesson in psychological manipulation. The most inescapable mental prisons are never made of rusted iron. They are expertly forged in solid gold, blinding the victim until the heavy door quietly clicks shut. Today, you and I will unpack this case file together. Notice how Luca keeps his voice wrapped in velvet, making the nightmare sound like friendly advice. He clinically notes her old number is synced to the new hardware. There is only one contact programmed. Elena stares at the phone as if a snake uncoiled on the table. She whispers a refusal, but Luca silences her with an empty look. His quiet tone is paralyzing. When she stammers she is just a tenant, he leans forward, revealing the dull steel of a handgun. He softly explains she is sleeping in the exact bedroom where Alessandro's mother took her final breath. Here is a simple life lesson. When the pieces of our lives align far too perfectly, it is rarely fate. It is a predator patiently baiting a psychological trap. Today, you and I are going to unpack the pathology of this case together. Observe the enforcer, Luca, executing a classic isolation protocol. He leans in, whispering that men have been executed for a mere fraction of Alessandro's attention. He establishes the parameters of her captivity. No visitors, complete silence, and forced normalcy under constant surveillance. Luca slides an encrypted phone across the table. When Elena's trembling fingers touch the casing, the screen illuminates with the initials A and V. It is a brilliant display of omnipresent control by a megalomaniac narcissist. This leaves us with a fundamental truth about human vulnerability. The boundary between a fiercely devoted protector and a clinically ruthless jailer is terrifyingly thin. By the time the victim recognizes the cage, the lock has already been turned. Note the subject's acute stress response. Elena shudders as the cognitive dissonance sets in. Her sanctuary is merely a beautifully constructed holding cell from the shadows. Alessandro corrects her assessment, labeling his obsession as love. He steps into the dim light, a predatory figure masking severe antisocial personality traits behind a meticulously tailored charcoal suit. With a singular, dismissive hand gesture, he removes his enforcer from the environment. Luca complies immediately, delivering one final behavioral warning before exiting. Elena is now entirely isolated with the architect of her psychological prison. We must acknowledge a difficult reality about human attachments. Occasionally, the suffocating control we instinctively fear is merely a deeply fractured psyche, attempting to articulate affection in the only violent language it understands. We observe a fascinating shift in the clinical environment under the harsh diner lighting. As Alessandro occupies the vinyl booth, the projected illusion of the invulnerable syndicate leader dissolves. Elena finally processes the severe physical toll of his high-risk lifestyle. A jagged scar traces his throat, while chronic sleep deprivation shadows his eyes. His hands provide a detailed forensic history, elegant, yet heavily textured with the scar tissue of repeatedly fractured knuckles. He monitors her autonomic fear response while poring with calculated, unnerving precision. Fear breeds caution, he quietly states, and caution breeds survival. This exposes a profound truth about human endurance. Quite often, the terrifying figures we desperately attempt to escape are the exact forces that can condition us to survive our most devastating trials. The subject exhibits classic somatic symptoms of distress. Elena shivers in an overheated room, carefully regulating her vocal pitch as she questions his ultimate objective. Alessandro evaluates her over his coffee, offering a rare admission that his own pathological motives remain unclear. Yet, the moment she challenges him, he pivots to aggressive psychological manipulation, probing the trauma surrounding her mother. The emotional destabilization is immediate. She fractures under the pressure, detailing the grueling history of stage 4 cancer and her profound isolation as an abandoned adolescent caretaker. It forces us to confront a clinical reality regarding unresolved grief. Deep psychological trauma never genuinely dissipates from the nervous system. We merely develop thicker emotional calluses over the decades to help us bear the staggering psychological load. Displaying acute panic, the subject demands to understand why her familial history is relevant. Alessandro leans into her personal space, executing a textbook escalation of psychological dominance. He systematically lowers his vocal register, disclosing that his own mother expired in that exact apartment, dying in the very bed Elena currently occupies. When she protests this deception, he clinically dismantles her perception of autonomy. He notes her severe financial distress. She was facing imminent eviction and possessed zero actual freedom of choice. Sliding a dense stack of $100 bills across the table, he issues a direct imperative to purchase food. This interaction highlights a brutal socioeconomic reality. Our most desperate vulnerabilities will continually remain exposed to the specific predatory figures perfectly positioned to financially exploit them. You and I must closely examine the clinical intimacy of this obsession. This megalomaniac narcissist has meticulously mapped her physiological baseline. He catalogs her skipped meals and fragmented sleep cycles with the precision of a behavioral researcher. He vocalizes her name using a frequency calibrated between hypnotic seduction and total authoritarian command, informing her that she has lost her anonymity. Merely existing in his territory has designated her as a target. He invades her proximity, overwhelming her olfactory senses with the sharp scent of cedar and residual gunshot residue. Elena registers a profound cognitive dissonance, a sickening horror stemming from her own emerging Stockholm Syndrome. It is a disturbing psychological truth. The chaotic danger we are biologically conditioned to escape is frequently the exact intense stimulation a severely isolated psyche craves. Maintaining unbroken eye contact, the subject issues a non-negotiable mandate. He rationalizes his extreme possessiveness as an essential security protocol, aggressively inquiring if other men dare to look at her. He exhibits a brief, chilling smile entirely devoid of empathetic warmth. Adjusting his cuffs with the deliberate mechanics of a sociopath, he establishes rigid behavioral parameters. She must remain barricaded, responding exclusively to his courier after a synchronized auditory signal. As he pivots to depart, Elena's trauma bond fully manifests, Bypassing her own self-preservation instincts, she softly asks when he plans to return. The immediate physiological flush of humiliation on her face is clinically tragic. It proves a disturbing behavioral baseline. The human brain reaches its most critical point of failure when it begins seeking emotional regulation from the exact source of its terror. The victim frantically attempts to construct a psychological boundary using her rental agreement as a shield. Alessandro responds by methodically donning his leather gloves. He neutralizes her defense, speaking in a measured cadence to assert that all contracts operate exclusively under his jurisdiction. Then he deploys the ultimate mechanism of control. He calmly advises her to adjust the framed photograph located on her bedside table. The realization of pervasive surveillance induces acute physiological shock. He casually admits to outfitting her sanctuary with optical pulse sensors, rationalizing this severe privacy violation as dedicated guardianship. He challenges her to differentiate between a protector and a captor. This highlights a morbid element of human psychology. We will rapidly trade our fundamental autonomy for a simulated sense of security, readily hallucinating that the reinforced bars of our cell are just a protective barrier. Following his departure, the primary subject dissolves into the urban environment. Elena remains anchored to unaccounted currency and an encrypted device functioning as a persistent psychological trigger. Over the subsequent 21 days, she enters a state of severe dissociation. Her occupational environment undergoes unauthorized modifications. Her supervisor abruptly eliminates her late-night shifts, providing empirical evidence of Alessandro's invisible, systemic influence over her life. When a coworker inquires about her situation, Elena actively engages in self-isolation, fabricating an elaborate narrative that frames her predatory landlord as a remarkably mundane citizen. The kingpin operates entirely as unseen variable, manipulating her reality from a distance. This demonstrates a heavy clinical consequence we must recognize. Sustaining complex, deceitful narratives generates profound neurological isolation, severing the subject completely from the baseline reality of the functioning world. Let us examine the psychological weight of this communication device together. The untraceable phone occupies her bedside table like a dormant biological threat, occasionally fracturing the darkness with encrypted nocturnal directives. He issues specific mandates, instructing her to bypass certain transit routes. The true neurological horror materializes 72 hours later, when those exact locations become the epicenters of catastrophic, highly publicized fatalities. Elena processes the devastating data. This individual is not anticipating urban violence. He is the central architect coordinating it. Direct physical contact remains negligible. She observes only the tinted glass of his surveillance vehicle or registers his heavy visual focus from the diner's perimeter. It imparts a dark clinical lesson regarding dominance. Legitimate, concentrated authority never actually requires a raised vocal register to psychologically paralyze a target into complete, involuntary submission. Their third interaction serves as a clinical study in nonverbal subjugation. Returning to her degraded residential's lobby, she observes him exiting a secured unit. A singular ocular lock, a fractional tilt of the cranium, and he completely assimilates into the low-visibility environment. However, the critical psychological rupture occurs during their fourth convergence. Atmospheric conditions indicate sub-zero temperatures. Elena is functioning on a catastrophic caloric deficit following an extended labor cycle. Her musculoskeletal system is severely compromised. She clutches her metallic keys as a primitive, entirely ineffective defensive measure against an inherently hostile urban sector. Her cognitive state is heavily eroded, craving only the restorative unconsciousness of REM sleep. This sequence highlights a predatory law of natural vulnerability. Catastrophic, paradigm-shifting trauma almost universally initiates its strike at the precise microsecond our neurological defenses hit absolute zero. The millisecond her footwear makes contact with the upper level, the simulated security of her habitat disintegrates. A chaotic vocalization of aggressive Italian floods the unlit corridor. Her limbic system correctly identifies the threat, flooding her cortex with adrenaline to initiate flight. Yet the sheer authoritarian gravity of Alessandro's voice induces involuntary paralysis. His charisma is eradicated, exposing the cold, sociopathic rage of an apex killer. He informs a distressed subordinate requires a permanent biological disloyalty, requires a permanent biological termination. The target's desperate pleading is abruptly nullified by the heavy, unmistakable acoustic signature of a deceased mass impacting the floorboards. An oppressive vacuum of sound follows. Elena remains physically immobilized, experiencing profound auditory exclusion. It provides a terminal behavioral insight. In an ecosystem governed by dominant predators, allowing the cognitive indulgence of morbid curiosity is frequently the final, fatal error a subject ever makes. Her acute terror betrays her completely. The clink of her keys rings through the bloody silence like a gunshot. The shift in Alessandro's voice is chilling. He drops into a terrifyingly calm register, casually whispering they have a witness. The thunderous approach of heavy boots breaks her paralysis. She sprints upward, the corridor stretching out like a hallucination. Her sweat-slicked hands fumble with the lock. She slams the deadbolt home mere seconds before the footsteps reach her door, retreating into the black kitchen to gasp for oxygen. We have all tasted that visceral fear. The meaningful lesson here is that when pure panic takes the wheel, it obliterates all rational logic, leaving us with nothing but the blinding urge to survive. Look closely at her in the dim apartment, a classic picture of a trapped mind. She considers calling the police, but the psychological chains binding her to this killer are already forged. 3 heavy knocks rattle the wood. Alessandro's voice slips through the gaps, demanding entry. When she stammers a refusal, he begins a cold 3-second countdown, whispering it would be a pity to ruin his late mother's favorite door. Her mind fractures under the pressure. Trembling, she slides the deadbolt, preferring the monster at the threshold over a violent intrusion. He waits in the shadows, perfectly calm. The lesson here is brutal but true. Sometimes we willingly open the door to our own ruin just to fool ourselves into believing we still hold the keys to our survival. He steps into the pale light, framed in a dark suit. He carries the scent of vetiver and unspoken violence, playing the untouchable kingpin. But Elena catches a fatal flaw. He washed up, yet fresh blood remains caked deep in his cuticles. He issues a quiet order, and the door shuts with the finality of a tomb. The reality of the blood hits her nervous system, and her knees give out completely. Here, the behavioral profile twists. Instead of hurting her, the monster kneels. He presses a surprisingly gentle, freezing hand against her pulsing throat, clinically pacing her rapid breaths. It serves as a sobering reminder for life. Pure terror can instantly strip away our deepest instincts, making us forget how to perform the simple, vital act of taking a single breath. Towering over her, he directs her breathing like a dark, meticulous conductor, in through the nose, out through the mouth. When Elena finally scrapes together the courage to ask if he killed the man, observe his flat affect. There is no denial, no human guilt. He simply whispers, yes. He shrugs off his jacket, sinking into the shadows to explain the grim mechanics of his worldview. Franco was stealing. Where Elena sees a horrific murder, Alessandro paints a clinical portrait of necessary duty. He merely removed a traitor who broke their laws. Watch his calm posture closely. It warns us of a vital, meaningful truth. The fastest way to invite darkness into your own mind is by searching for rational excuses to justify the unforgivable actions of a total monster. Let us analyze her reaction. Elena stares at this well-dressed killer, frantically searching his face for a single drop of human guilt. She finds nothing but the cold calculation of an apex predator. Expecting to be his next victim, she holds her breath in pure somatic dread. Instead, he leans, pinning her with his dark gaze. He commands her to erase the entire night from her mind. In the vicious economy of a megalomaniac, total ignorance is the only currency that buys survival. It is a bitter pill, but here is a simple life lesson. Sometimes the truth does not set you free. It only paints a bright red target on your back. To survive the encroaching wolves, her broken psyche begins to manifest Stockholm Syndrome, desperately clinging to the very monster she fears. The psychological tension is thick enough to suffocate them. The silence feels like the ringing in your ears after a gun goes off. While Elena shakes, Alessandro delivers a freezing dose of reality. The syndicate cleaners sweeping the city are savages, men who make his violence look like mercy. She only wanted a quiet life, yet life teaches us a tragic lesson. Fate has a cruel way of extracting a bloody toll for the peace we desperately crave. Pacing to the window, he stares out and clinically declares that no one touches what belongs to the boss. When she fiercely whispers she is not his property, he slowly turns. His dark eyes burn with a deeply toxic, narcissistic obsession. Whether she likes it or not, his terrifying name has just become her only bulletproof vest. Elena tries to anchor her sanity, arguing that accepting his protection does not mean signing away her soul. But the narcissist refuses her that illusion. He crosses the room, forcing her chin up to meet his dead gaze. He calls her bluff, asking why a smart woman has not already vanished. When she stammers she has nowhere to run, he softly tears the lie apart. The reality of human nature offers a stark life lesson. We often choose the familiar monster right in front of us over the unknown shadows we cannot see. Normal men treated her like a ghost, but this killer looks at her like she is the only thing breathing. He raises his hand, letting his fingertips hover a fraction of an inch from her jaw, turning the silence into a weapon of absolute psychological control. Let's watch her body language carefully, you and I. He coldly points out the tension between them, whispering that this twisted connection is the only reason she is alive. Elena is trapped in a mental collapse. Her logic screams to run, but here is a lesson about our brains. Human biology is a devious trickster. Too often, primal survival instincts put on the mask of deep desire, pulling us blindly toward the fire. She catches herself leaning into his warmth, beginning to crave the very hands she should fear. When she asks what he wants in return, his answer is a masterclass in psychological control. He orders her to forget the violence, go to sleep, and pretend tomorrow is normal. Slowly brushing her lower lip, he swears that no one else will ever touch her. The camera pushes in, capturing the exact second her spirit shatters under Stockholm Syndrome. When Elena demands to know how he can keep her safe, Alessandro does not blink. He promises, in a voice like broken glass, that anyone who steps near her will die screaming. He wears his identity as a ruthless monster with pride, so long as he guards his claimed territory. Before her mind builds another rational wall, he closes the distance, crashing his mouth over hers, and twisting his fingers into her hair. It is a tragic life lesson. Rigid morals crumble to dust the second desperate, survivalist passion takes over. She should have fought him off. Instead, She kisses the architect of her nightmare, letting out a fractured sigh of absolute, hopeless surrender. His hand slides down her waist, crushing her against his chest. To Elena, he tastes of whiskey and sheer danger. Every terrified nerve catches fire, overriding her cognitive reasoning. For one reckless beat, the fresh blood on his hands ceases to exist. We must remember a vital life lesson. Human beings are most vulnerable the moment they allow themselves to forget the things that should rightfully terrify them. Her hands twist into his lapels, holding onto the hurricane. Then, without warning, the narcissist violently rips himself away. His chest heaves in the shadows, his dead eyes are a terrifying war between savage hunger and calculated iron discipline. Dropping his voice to a ragged whisper, he tells her to sleep, ordering her to throw the deadbolt. Backing into the shadows, he issues a sharp command to keep the lock thrown against the world. He smooths his jacket, but the analytical eye catches a faint tremor in his hands. He tells her to keep her phone close, to call if a floorboard creaks. She gives a fragile nod, and he quietly calls her a good girl. It is a manipulative stroke, making her feel completely possessed, yet safe. He announces he will collect her for dinner tomorrow at 7. She stammers an excuse about her shift, but he coldly replies he has already erased it. Here is our final lesson. Real power never asks for permission. It forcefully rewrites reality to suit its own narcissistic needs. His dead eyes rake over her trembling frame one last time before he whispers his final order. Wear something beautiful. Today, you and I are going to unpack a classic psychiatric case file of trauma bonding right as it begins. The door clicks shut, sealing Elena inside the deafening quiet of her apartment. The sharp taste of the syndicate boss still burns against her mouth. She shakes uncontrollably, sliding the deadbolt twice. Clinically speaking, the woman in the mirror is experiencing acute depersonalization. Her lips are bruised, skin flushed with dangerous adrenaline. Suddenly, her phone cuts through the dark. A message from Alessandro, waiting on the freezing street below. He commands her to sleep, promising to sit in the shadows until sunrise. This is textbook manipulation. He creates the terror, then perfectly positions himself as her only source of absolute safety. In analyzing this file, a healthy mind would recognize the immediate threat of a predator. But what we observe here is the onset of a trauma bond. Elena receives absolute control disguised as protection, which acts as a highly addictive psychological narcotic. Instead of triggering survival instincts, a paralyzing warmth overwhelms her. Exhausted, she collapses onto the mattress. When morning sun breaks through the blinds, she desperately hopes the previous night was a mere hallucination. Then, the rich aroma of espresso floods the room. A perfectly brewed cup sits on her nightstand. He had already been back inside her sanctuary. The clinical lesson here is sobering. Our minds will often accept a beautifully decorated cage just to escape a terrifying reality. The psychological gravity of her situation is total collapse. The subject bypassed her physical locks, invading her most vulnerable state while she slept. Today, you and I are going to unpack this pathology together. He stood close enough to monitor her, breathing, leaving the cup without a sound. Now her nervous system misfires, hands shaking against the china. The brew is tailored perfectly to her preferences. A hallmark trait of a megalomaniac narcissist who catalogs his victim's every habit. Beside it lies a thick card demanding her presence. A healthy subject would flee. But trauma creates a dark labyrinth. The human condition reveals we are often hypnotized by the exact forces that threaten to destroy us. She simply sits in the quiet room, drinking the coffee he made. We observe a clinical state of desperation. Elena is paralyzed before a sparse closet, staring at the suffocating black garment from her mother's funeral. She teeters on the psychological edge of total ruin. Suddenly, her device illuminates the dark, delivering a non-negotiable directive from the syndicate leader to look outside. She moves toward the door with the dissociated gait of someone trapped in a night terror. At her threshold sits a pristine white box, bound in a heavy, dark ribbon. Her sympathetic nervous system activates, her pulse hammering. The clinical truth we must acknowledge is simple. Pride becomes an unbearable weight when a person is stripped of all resources. Sometimes, the biological mandate to survive requires a victim to surrender and untie the ribbon. Her self-preservation instincts fire rapidly, signaling her to retreat. Accepting a token from a man defined by severe violent behaviors crosses an irreversible psychological threshold. Yet, her motor functions betray her logic as her fingers slide the ribbon free. Beneath the tissue lies a heavy, flawless emerald gown, precisely measured to her anatomy. Concealed within are sharp heels and a velvet case of gold jewelry. This is not generosity. It is a calculated demonstration of omnipotence by a megalomaniac. The observation here is a fundamental rule of human vulnerability. The most dangerous predators never approach looking like monsters. They arrive draped in flawless aesthetics, bypassing our cognitive defenses before we even realize we are under an active attack. The jewels present a terrifying psychological trap. In behavioral analysis, an extravagant gesture from an apex predator is never a gift. It is a contractual demand for submission. Her device glows with a message from Alessandro, noting the stones perfectly match her irises, proving he systematically studied her. Her hands tremble as she types a refusal. His counter is a masterclass in coercive control. He minimizes the manipulation, calling it mere fabric, while implanting a subtle threat to breach her perimeter again. She spends the day in severe cognitive dissonance, fixated on the traumatic bonding of his kiss. We must digest this grim reality. The most fatal traps in a person's life are often the ones they subconsciously desire to step into. At 6 o'clock, we document a profound psychological metamorphosis. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? She stands under scalding water, scrubbing away the dissociative fog of her existence. She lifts the garment. The emerald fabric drapes over her frame, highlighting the physical presence she's had suppressed as a trauma response. The instant she steps into the elevated footwear, her biomechanics alter. She suddenly projects a commanding authority. Adorned in the gold, she observes a highly competent, unfamiliar identity in the glass. It is a textbook cognitive restructuring. This teaches us something vital. Sometimes an individual must adopt an elaborate disguise just to safely integrate the formidable shadow self they were always meant to become. The reflection displays a highly resilient subject, manifesting the psychological fortitude her environment had buried. At 6:58, 3 methodical strikes hit her door. She finds Alessandro presenting as a tailored sociopath, offering a single red rose. As he processes her appearance, his pupils dilate, a microscopic breach in a megalomaniac's emotional regulation. He utters a quiet expletive of genuine shock. When she defensively deflects attention to the garment, he closes the distance. Smelling of rich cedar, he asserts that the fabric merely externalizes the internal power he diagnosed immediately. The clinical takeaway is clear. Highly observant individuals will correctly assess your inherent value long before you wear the external markers of power. The tension in the confined corridor is clinically palpable. He extends the rose. Elena accepts it, her tremors betraying severe panic. Their physical contact initiates an acute autonomic response. You can visibly track the hypervigilant clenching of his jaw. He directs her toward a unit radiating warm light. This was the exact site of a brutal syndicate termination weeks prior, demonstrating chilling compartmentalization. He claims he erased the violence so she would never perceive it. Yet, the traumatic memory remains permanently imprinted in her brain. Regardless, she links her arm with his and enters. The bleakest reality of human adaptation is this. Sometimes, rejecting an active threat feels far more psychologically dangerous than knowingly walking straight into the fire. Stick with me. This is where the psychopathology becomes fascinating. The room has been completely sterilized of its violent history, replaced by amber lighting and crystal. Elena exhibits a freeze response, questioning if he orchestrated this massive manipulation in a single day. He uses deflective framing, casually referencing his subordinates to reinforce his dominance. Yet, he shows contradictory behaviors, meticulously pulling out her chair to establish false security. When she interrogates his motives, the inquiry pierces his narcissistic armor. Pouring a rare vintage, he confesses she deserves beautiful things. We uncover a tragic vulnerability here. A human mind is most susceptible to sudden affection when it has endured a lifetime of chronic emotional deprivation. We observe a shift in vocal modulations as he initiates a psychological grooming phase. He profiles her history of parasitic relationships, positioning himself as the provider. Elena's cognitive defenses activate, rejecting his assumed intimacy. A predatory smirk crosses his womb. She consumes the wine. His eyes lock onto her respiratory rate. Abruptly, she shatters the dynamic, interrogating him about his mother and dragging his systemic violence to the table. He exhibits physiological rigidity, stating that homicide is off-limits. She coldly counters that kissing a tenant murder is equally appropriate. The psychological law is absolute. Brutal truths will always forcefully inject themselves into the present, no matter how beautifully you set the table. The accusations suspend the space like a physical threat. Elena realizes she has pushed an antisocial personality to the brink. We document extreme somatic tension. His knuckles blanch against the glass, his jaw muscles spasming. Aggressive escalation seems neurologically inevitable. Instead, he deploys a discordant response. An authentic laugh. Reclining, he validates her challenge. She quietly probes if his mother was complicit in organized crime. His emotional baseline flatlines instantly. His tone calcifies, detailing a woman oblivious to her partner's psychopathy until the entrapment was complete. One failed escape extinguished her resistance permanently. The clinical observation is devastating. Profound emotional attachment and paralyzing terror are frequently constructed from the exact same psychological materials. Alessandro exhibits the textbook behaviors of a megalomaniac narcissist. He weaponizes his trauma, stating his mother endured nightmares solely to keep him breathing. When Elena apologizes, his psychological armor instantly hardens. He insists her suffering gave him the hypervigilance to read power, and the ruthless drive to protect his possessions. He locks his gaze onto her, claiming his mother would have respected her strength. His enforcer, Luca, suddenly barges in with their meal, radiating hostile submission. Alessandro smoothly takes the plates, playing the benevolent provider. Let us examine this clinical horror together. The absolute scariest manifestation of total control is how flawlessly it disguises itself as genuine care. Let us open this psychological case file together and examine the exact moment courtship devolves into terror. Serving the meal, the kingpin notes his subject is underweight, casually dropping that his security monitors her groceries. Elena freezes. Her nervous system triggers a profound panic response. Leaning back with the terrifying smirk of a megalomaniac narcissist, He admits to hard-wiring hidden cameras outside her door. He reframes this absolute violation of autonomy as mandatory protection, clinically instructing her to accept his surveillance. They finish their plates in suffocating silence. You and I must remember this fundamental law of human behavior. A beautifully decorated cage is still a cage, no matter how much gold lines the heavy iron bars. The clinical observation continues as the subject trembles, her motor functions betraying immense cognitive dissonance. Elena begs for the truth. Why select her out of the thousands of women available to his violent empire? The kingpin lowers his silver fork, the metal clinking against the porcelain. He studies her with predatory focus, recalling how she stared at a bloodied room on her very first day. As if it were a sanctuary, his scarred hands eclipse her pale fingers. He notes her flinching trauma response when he first asked her name. He swears he is the one man who refuses to break her further. It illustrates a tragic psychiatric reality. The most agonizing, deep-seated traumas will always recognize each other across any room, instantly binding the broken together. We observe a textbook escalation of psychological tension. The narcissist leans across the table, lowering his voice to a hypnotic frequency. He offers her dominion, swearing to construct a palace rather than demolish her fragile stability. Elena experiences an acute spike of dread. She correctly identifies his obsession, not as affection, but as a suffocating compulsion for absolute ownership. Yet, within the dark pathology of his mind, genuine love and total possession are entirely indistinguishable. He promises to forcefully reprogram her understanding of safety through a twisted honor code. This brings us to a deeply unsettling truth. When a dangerous man builds a prison, the true trap is never the lock. The real trap is the terrifying comfort you eventually find inside. Let us dissect this behavioral conditioning piece by piece. Their dinner unfolds like a calculated hypnotic induction. They exchange accounts of childhood isolation, entirely suppressing the reality of the violence staining his history. In a dangerous alignment of psychologies, they uncover a shared fixation on tragic literature. He deploys his lethal charm with clinical precision, projecting a dry humor that bypasses her defense mechanisms. Elena sits in silent paralysis, terrified by her own neurological urge to surrender. By 9 o'clock, his massive frame eclipses the hallway light. Instead of a physical claim, he gently kisses her forehead, sealing an unspoken psychological contract. It leaves a haunting lesson. We rarely flee the devil when he wears the flawless manners of a gentleman. The fragile environmental control shatters in a fraction of a second. A deafening blast detonates on the lower level, sending violent, kinetic shockwaves through the glass. Before the subject can process the stimuli, the romantic facade evaporates, revealing the cold-blooded predator beneath. He violently pins her against the plaster, shielding her body mass with his own as he draws a heavy firearm. Luca breaches the splintered door, his tailored suit saturated with arterial blood, reporting the rival family has penetrated their perimeter. The megalomaniac does not exhibit panic. His facial muscles lock in stillness as he computes the impending slaughter. It proves a visceral truth. When chaos erupts, polite masks disintegrate, exposing the raw predators we truly are. Luca struggles for oxygen, reporting 8 armed hostiles sweeping the lower sectors. The kingpin absorbs this grim mathematics, without a single physiological spike in distress. A secondary explosion ruptures the corridor architecture, instantly plunging the environment into pitch-black isolation. In the dark, he crushes Elena against his chest, and she registers his sudden erratic heartbeat. This ruthless apex aggressor is suddenly paralyzed by the intense phobia of losing his primary fixation. He issues harsh commands, demanding absolute obedience to ensure her biological survival. Shock forces her into a state of mute compliance. This unearths a crucial realization. True survival is never about fighting every battle. Real strength is the clinical wisdom to know exactly when to run. Panic fully compromises Elena's rational processing as she demands his tactical plan. The narcissist emotionally flatlines, declaring he will remain at the epicenter. He physically redirects her toward Luca, but his possessive pathology fractures his restraint, violently pulling her back. He initiates an agonizing kiss, heavily loaded with traumatic grief. Staring into her dilated pupils, he delivers a staggering psychological anchor. If the rival syndicate terminates him tonight, his entire criminal empire transfers to her. She psychologically shatters, begging for a reversal, but he dissolves into the smoke, commanding strict forward motion. It paints a devastating portrait. The most tragic manifestation of devotion is the absolute destruction of oneself, just to keep the subject safe. You and I must observe the pathology of the subordinates here. The stairwell concrete amplifies the chaotic discharge of weapons. Luca hisses at the subject to discard her footwear. She kicks the heels aside, her bare skin striking the freezing floor. Below them, the kingpin barks a command in Italian, followed by the sudden cessation of a man's scream. Elena weeps, convinced her captor is walking into a fatal ambush. Luca interrupts her grief with clinical reality. The boss is highly capable of slaughtering the hostile force, provided his cognitive focus is not compromised by her. They breach the roof door into the biting chill. It reveals a haunting reality. The outside world remains completely blind to the violent, private tragedies bleeding out in the dark shadows. The enforcer physically drags her across the abrasive roof gravel toward a 4-foot concrete abyss. Elena exhibits intense avoidance behavior, recoiling from the fatal drop. We must analyze Luca's psychological state through the lens of Stockholm Syndrome. He is trauma-bonded to the very megalomaniac who controls his existence. He forces Elena to face reality. The kingpin is not prey. He is a hyper-lethal organism forged in decades of extreme violence. Luca insists the hostile intruders are statistically dead. Yet, if Elena is captured, that variable will fatally shatter the boss's tactical focus. It illuminates a deeply uncomfortable truth. Our frantic desire to rescue an attachment figure often becomes the exact variable that guarantees their total destruction. The severe wind triggers tearing in her eyes as she absolutely refuses to abandon her violent protector. Luca ignores her desperate bargaining phase, pacing the perimeter to calculate the required velocity. He issues a direct order for her to leap, strictly for visual contact with the street below. Generating kinetic momentum, Luca launches his body across the gap, achieving a stabilized landing on the adjacent structure. He pivots, screaming for her to execute the jump. But Elena is psychologically paralyzed, demonstrating genuine suicidal ideation to perish alongside her captor. Recognizing this, Luca ruthlessly weaponizes her trauma bond, shouting that her hesitation is a direct death sentence for the kingpin. True courage is often just blinding yourself and leaping into the dark void. Let us pause here and consider the mechanics of manipulation. Luca's voice slices through the wind, stripping away her denial. He demands to know if she intends to be the psychological weapon that terminates the boss. The accusation strikes her central nervous system like blunt force trauma. You and I know this phenomenon well. You and I knows a suffocating blanket of induced guilt will always control a subject far more effectively than physical terror. That localized guilt overrides her paralysis. She forces her battered physiology into rapid motion, suspended for a fatal heartbeat over the concrete canyon. She crashes into the opposite gravel. They scramble down the rusted fire escape, her lacerated feet leaving biological markers. Instantly, the primary structure erupts in catastrophic thermal expansion. The auditory environment is saturated with ballistic fire and structural collapse. Elena engages in severe psychological blocking, refusing to visualize the biological destruction of her captor. They hit the alleyway, inhaling the chemical markers of ozone and precipitation. Exhibiting textbook operational caution, the conditioning, Lucas secures an unmarked transport vehicle. He commands the operative to bury her off-grid. This highlights a profound clinical friction. While traumatic attachment drives suicidal proximity, genuine protective loyalty demands the agonizing discipline of physical separation. The enforcer softens his rigid affect for a singular moment, swearing the boss will locate her. But Elena collapses into the vehicle, vocalizing the ultimate fear. What happens to the subject if the captor simply expires? Luca presents a fascinating case of traumatic conditioning, his expression completely devoid of normal emotion. He promises, with absolute certainty, that Alessandro will survive. He confesses he has fought beside the kingpin since childhood, and has never witnessed his boss fixate on a subject the way he fixates on her. He vows Alessandro would willingly reduce heaven and hell to ash to retrieve his prized possession. This dangerous devotion is not whispered in safety. It is forged in the inferno of shared trauma. Delivering his solemn vow, Luca charges directly back into the fatal gunfight. As the vehicle accelerates, Elena presses her hands to the cold glass, clinically mesmerized by the terrifying flashes of muzzle fire consuming the upper floors. You and I must analyze this environment together, as it illustrates the psychological pressure cooker of isolation. Elena paces the floorboards of a freezing safe house. Her gown serves as a jarring anomaly in this sterile space. Outside, an armed guard reinforces her captivity. She grips the telephone until her knuckles turn white, exhibiting physical tremors of acute anxiety while Alessandro fights his syndicate war. 1 hour bleeds pathologically into 3, and the sensory deprivation becomes agonizing. At 1:47 in the morning, the dead air shatters with a sudden noise. We observe a universal behavioral truth here. In moments of profound neurological crisis, the helpless anticipation of trauma is always heavier than the violence itself. The sudden telephone ring triggers a severe auditory startle response. Elena answers immediately, her motor skills failing as she grips the receiver. Hearing Alessandro speak in a detached cadence causes her psychological defenses to collapse. She frantically asks if he is injured, but he dismisses her panic with a flat affect typical of an antisocial personality. He calmly states the threat at an slaughtered hot squad, like a mundane logistical variable. He orders her to remain hidden, but she weeps, exhibiting the deep emotional dependency of Stockholm Syndrome. We must remember a basic physiological reality. The human nervous system only registers true psychological relief through the physical validation of an attachment figure. Alessandro drops his voice into a manipulative whisper, probing her mental state by asking what she truly desires. She begs him to return, unknowingly feeding his narcissistic supply with her desperate attachment. A heavy silence follows, filled only by his ragged breathing. He commands her to sleep, but the severe hyperarousal of her nervous system makes rest impossible. The call disconnects, leaving the subject nearly catatonic. She rejects the nourishment offered by her handler, regressing into a fetal position. She watches the window transition from pitch black to a pale morning blue, locked in vigilant paralysis. At 6:23, a noise ruptures the room. This demonstrates how profound powerlessness brutally, warps a subject's internal perception of time. A sharp knock pierces the room. The guard steps aside, allowing Alessandro to enter. Observe this clinical visual with me. It perfectly captures his destructive pathology. The kingpin's tailored suit is saturated in blood. A laceration splits his brow, and blunt force trauma marks his jaw. He guards his fractured ribs with every step, yet his predatory survival instinct remains intact. Elena stands in a dissociative daze, dropping her blanket to stare at the brutal toll of his violent reality. Recognizing this shared trauma response, the guard silently retreats. This interaction reveals a raw psychiatric baseline. When the ego's armor is violently stripped away, only egum capti, primitive honesty remains between a captor and his willing captive. 8 casualties, he whispers, establishing a clinical body count. A rival faction sent a unit to dismantle his enterprise. He asks if she understands their fatal error, and she numbly shakes her head. They mistakenly hypothesized that emotional attachment would diminish his aggression. He explains how they deeply miscalculated the mind of a megalomaniac narcissist. Securing an object of affection does not pacify a violent man. It provides a rationalized justification for his brutality. When operatives threatened his prized possession, his homicidal purpose fully crystallized. Let us analyze this behavioral mechanism. For extreme personalities, attachment does not calm internal chaos. It simply becomes the lethal weapon used to eradicate all perceived enemies. Alessandro presses his bruised knuckle against her cheek to enforce physical proximity. Locking onto her gaze, he verbalizes the ultimate narcissistic demand. He requires absolute ownership of her existence, systematically claiming her schedule, her anxieties, and her unquestioning compliance. He displays zero cognitive dissonance about his sociopathy, freely promising to commit atrocities to ensure her survival. He constructs an isolated paradigm where her identity relies entirely on his validation. As autonomic tears fall, Elena accurately diagnoses his proposal as a gilded psychological cage. The clinical's lesson embedded in her distress is undeniable. Total security invariably exacts a devastating toll, and absolute safety is frequently synonymous with total captivity. He presses his forehead to hers, establishing a disorienting intimacy. He murmurs a denial, rebranding his control as a protective fortress. Let us analyze this manipulation tactic together. He presents his terms through a calculated display of vulnerability, offering the pure illusion of autonomy. He claims she may walk away, though stating her departure would psychologically destroy him. He withdraws slightly, simulating emotional fragility to trigger her caretaking instincts. With a rehearsed break in his voice, he begs her to consciously choose the monster. This illustrates a paradox in trauma bonding. The captor never overtly clips the victim's wings. They simply architect a psychological sky where the subject becomes completely terrified to ever fly anywhere else. Elena locks eyes with this apex predator, experiencing severe cognitive dissonance. He just executed a tactical slaughter for her, framing his antisocial behavior as romantic devotion. Her logical brain signals an urgent flight response away from the bloodshed. However, her neural pathways are already compromised by Stockholm Syndrome, overriding self-preservation with a pathological drive to remain with her protector. When she questions the threat of rival syndicates, Alessandro employs radical honesty. He admits he can mitigate the daily chaos, but cannot erase the systemic targets on his back. The clinical prognosis here is tragic. Bonding with a highly volatile subject requires the complete, willing assimilation into the chronic violence that perpetually surrounds them. She asks the final diagnostic question. If she submits to this dynamic, what is the trajectory? His hand tightens against her flesh, guaranteeing absolute invulnerability. Anyone threatening her faces lethal retaliation. She would adopt his surname and become a fixed asset in his syndicate. Elena's breathing shifts at the prospect of marriage, prompting the kingpin to consciously soften his micro-expressions. He claims this formalization will only happen once she stops viewing his fixation as a toxic obsession. He openly confesses his violent devotion is the closest proxy for love his fractured psyche can generate. We must acknowledge the reality of such patience. Disordered individuals cannot process normative romance, but their intense territorial loyalty forms a completely impenetrable psychological vault. The standoff concludes as Kara executes a completely counterintuitive response. She covers the kingpin's ruined knuckles, pulverized by the violence committed on her behalf. A normative subject would have fled. Instead, she exhibits the final stage of Stockholm Syndrome, kissing his battered palm. This contact acts as an acute trigger. His mouth crashes against hers, exhibiting a predatory possessiveness tasting of iron. She pulls him closer, ignoring his pain receptors as their traumatized bodies violently collide. When he demands confirmation, she whispers her intent to build a stable reality within his psychological hell. Let us review this final case note together. The deepest neurological bonds are rarely formed in safe environments. They are fiercely forged in the absolute darkest crucibles of shared trauma. We observe Alessandro using physical intimacy to soothe his traumatized target. He makes grandiose promises to dismantle a rival syndicate, a textbook display of megalomania. When Kara sees blood weeping through his shredded shirt, she begs for a doctor. His refusal is fascinating. He claims he only needs sleep and her presence, making her his emotional anchor. She guides him into the shadows, fully assuming the caregiver role of her trauma bond. Watching him shed that ruined suit exposes the violent toll of his predator lifestyle, every bruise documenting his brutality. Yet this brings us to a simple lesson about the human condition. Even the most violently antisocial people harbor a terrifying vulnerability. When they finally drop their heavy armor for the sake of connection, let us examine the pathology in this quiet room together. They remain on the bed. The subject is stripped to his battered skin, while Kara is paralyzed by exhaustion in her emerald dress. Alessandro pulls her against his chest, displaying severe territorial attachment. He murmurs deep gratitude for her compliance. She laces her fingers through his damaged hands, a clear symptom of Stockholm Syndrome taking root. Sleep finally overtakes his nervous system, but his possessive grip remains unyielding. Kara simply lies awake as dawn turns the ceiling gold, hypnotized by the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. It brings us to a simple fact about human survival. The most profound and lasting peace often deceives us, arriving directly after we weather the absolute worst psychological storms. As pale dawn illuminates the room, we observe a shattered reality. Kara blinks awake, her nervous system strung tight along a razor wire of constant danger. Yet she rests calmly, anchored by a trauma bond so severe it mimics true devotion. Alessandro is by every psychiatric metric an absolute monster. But here lies the tragic clinical irony. This sociopath is the only shield keeping rival predators from her door. She initially sought out a cheap apartment, accidentally stumbling into a criminal enterprise. 3 months later, she wakes in his Beacon Hill penthouse under his possessive gaze. The psychological lesson here is simple but grim. Sometimes, the very shadows that should rightfully terrify our primal instincts become the only sanctuaries our desperate minds will ever accept. We watch her stretch, showing complete acclimation to her captivity. Sunlight catches the heavy emerald ring he placed on her hand 2 weeks ago. In criminal psychology, This is not a proposal, but a branding ritual, a guarantee of ownership disguised as affection. With manic eagerness, the kingpin guides her into his office. Usually, this space radiates the hostility of a command center. Today, his massive oak desk is pushed aside. In its place sits an easel displaying a framed deed to the Beacon Hill property, legally transferred into her name. It is the ultimate manipulative gesture. Take this simple life lesson to heart. When someone truly cares for you, they do not offer empty words. They move heaven and earth to secure the ground beneath your feet, even if they must steal it to do so. Her initial instinct is self-preservation. She recoils, insisting she cannot accept the asset. Alessandro suppresses her resistance, wrapping his arms around her waist in a posture of physical dominance. He whispers that if rival factions dismantle his empire, this deed guarantees her survival. Kara spins in his grip, fiercely swearing she will never abandon him. The kingpin smiles, executing a classic psychological trap. He claims he needs her to hold the power to leave, simply to validate that her presence is voluntary. She teases that it is just a beautiful cage, missing the depth of her own conditioning. Look closely at this dynamic with me. True love cannot breathe without choice. It only carries lasting weight when we offer it to another human being with completely open hands. He kisses her temple, feeding her the illusion of autonomy. He claims he is giving her wings, ensuring the choice to fly is hers alone. Kara stares at the ink, holding tangible proof of an independence she will never use. She looks up at the scarred predator before her, a man who has eliminated human lives to guarantee her safety. Her mind has rewritten his lethal possessiveness as fierce protection. In the tense quiet, she surrenders entirely to the trauma bond, whispering that she is wildly in love with him. Alessandro freezes in shock, his narcissistic armor cracked by her complete submission. His methods are steeped in violence, but the life lesson stands. To truly love someone is to hold their absolute ugliest flaws up to the harsh light, and fiercely choose to stay anyway. She maintains eye contact with this ruthless boss and tells him he is enough, completing their psychological merger. The tension snaps. Alessandro pulls her into a crushing embrace, his frame trembling with an unfiltered emotional discharge. He admits he lacks the capacity for soft empathy. Instead, he offers a terrifying vow. There is no moral boundary he will not shatter, no brutal body count he will not eagerly achieve to ensure her preservation. Kara smiles, rationalizing his sociopathy as a dangerous but genuine form of affection. A rare, fractured laugh escapes his throat. Stick with me, because here is an undeniable human truth. The things the outside world dismisses as hopelessly broken are often the exact missing pieces we need to make our own fractured minds whole. Kara mentally measures the clinical chasm between her current state and the terrified civilian she was 90 days ago. That anxious ghost would never recognize the fiercely conditioned woman standing here today. She went hunting for a simple apartment, only to embed herself deeply within the trenches of a crime syndicate, Infernalitas crime seed. She found a paradoxical freedom with a pathological manipulator who held the power to imprison her, but handed her the keys to secure her loyalty. Yes, this freedom is strictly monitored, wrapped in armored glass and guarded by armed men, but she perceives it as her own conscious choice. Consider this undeniable truth about human survival. Sometimes, the absolute safest place to weather the storm is right in the dead, quiet center of a raging hurricane. Alessandro buries his face in her neck, using sensory contact to regulate his baseline anxiety. He begs her back to bed, demanding the outside world wait. Kara catches his scarred hand, her trauma response now indistinguishable from romantic devotion. She whispers that the entire world could burn to ash, so long as he remains beside her. He pulls her tight, swearing a grandiose oath that she will possess him entirely. Wrapped in the embrace of her predator, the jagged pieces of her fractured psyche finally slot together. She feels perfectly secure, ignoring the target painted on his back. Let us pause on this behavioral reality. We spend our lives furiously chasing absolute independence. But the truest freedom is finding the one person who finally anchors your wandering soul. As we conclude our observation, Kara understands her true home was never meant to be built from cold brick. Her sanctuary is a living apex predator. It resides entirely in the security of his arms, forged by the heavy weight of his possessive love. She sees his unvarnished pathology, acutely aware of the extreme violence shadowing his every step. Yet she actively chooses this chaos, and this terrifying man completely devoid of regret. As you and I finally close this case file, carry this harsh truth forward. Real connection rarely arrives wrapped in a neat bow. Sometimes it shows up bruised, bleeding, and bearing heavy psychological scars. But when that bond acts as an iron shield against a bitter, freezing world, you grab onto it with both hands, and you never let go.